The air in Dawson City bit with an intensity that went right through Henry's thick woolen coat and into his bones. It was October of 1898, and the first serious snow of the season had already dusted the narrow, muddy streets, turning the surrounding taiga into a landscape of stark, unforgiving white. The false promise of gold had lured him here 2 years ago, a fool's errand that had stripped him of his savings, his health, and most of his hope. Now, all he had left was a dilapidated cabin a few miles upriver and a gnawing, unbearable loneliness. He stood in front of the makeshift post office, the wood worn and grey, the sign above it barely legible. His breath misted in the frigid air as he clutched the letter in his hand. It was the only tangible thing he possessed that spoke of a future beyond the daily grind of freezing creeks and endless disappointment. The letter was a contract, a deal he'd made with a dubious broker in Seattle, promising him a wife from the civilized world, a woman to share his life and his struggles. A horse-drawn sledge pulled up, a mountain of supplies piled high, and a man, a trader Henry knew only as Silas, jumped down, his face chapped and red. "Henry, you're still here," Silas grunted, his eyes glinting with a shrewd, calculating light. "Thought you'd have packed it in by now." "Just waiting on a delivery," Henry said, his voice a low rumble. "Ah, yes, your special delivery," Silas said, a sly smile spreading across his face. "She's here. Took her a week to get from Skagway. A tough one, too. Didn't complain once." Henry's heart hammered against his ribs. He pictured her, a woman with soft hands and a warm smile, perhaps a schoolteacher or a farmer's daughter, someone from a life he'd almost forgotten. He imagined her cooking a hot meal, her presence filling the hollow silence of his cabin. But then Silas gestured to the back of the sledge, and Henry's blood ran cold. Huddled among the sacks of flour and coils of rope was a young girl, no older than 16, her face framed by a caribou skin hood. Her eyes, dark and wide, stared out from the furs, not with fear, but with a quiet, unsettling dignity. Her skin was a shade of burnished copper, and her clothes were made of traditional furs and leather, not the prim cotton dresses he had envisioned. "Silas," Henry's voice was strained, barely a whisper. "This isn't a woman from the south. This is an Eskimo girl." Silas's smile was a thin, cruel line. "The broker made a mistake, said she was a hardy type. A mistake in translation, perhaps. Doesn't matter, does it? The deal is the deal. She's the bride you paid for. I've delivered her, and now my business is done." Silas dropped the rope that held the girl's hands loosely tied and began to unload his supplies, ignoring Henry's shocked protests. Henry stood frozen, a maelstrom of anger, disappointment and confusion swirling within him. He had been swindled. The lonely ache in his chest was now replaced by a sharp, bitter resentment. He had been promised a wife, a companion, a piece of home. Instead, he had been given a child, an innocent pawn in a cruel game. As Silas finished unloading and prepared to leave, the girl untied her hands and slipped off the sledge, her movements quick and graceful. She didn't look at Silas. She looked at Henry. He saw no fear in her eyes, just a deep, unreadable acceptance. "My name is Anya," she said in a soft, accented voice. "I was told to come with you." Henry stared at her, the freezing wind stinging his cheeks. He couldn't go back to his cabin alone, not after this. But how could he bring her with him? A stranger, a child, from a world he didn't understand, forced into a cruel and impossible situation. The road ahead felt longer and more daunting than any of his gold-hunting expeditions. His dreams of companionship had shattered, replaced by an even more profound and complex loneliness. The loneliness of two different worlds colliding in a single, desolate cabin in the middle of a frozen wilderness. If you've enjoyed this story so far, be sure to subscribe to the channel to get the next chapter of Henry and Anya's journey. We have plenty more immersive stories to come. The walk to the cabin was a lesson in silent, escalating tension. The wind, now a biting gale, whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. Henry stomped through the thin layer of ice covering the trail, his boots crunching loudly. Anya followed silently, her steps light and sure on the treacherous ground, as if she were a part of the landscape. Henry was consumed by a quiet rage. He had worked his fingers to the bone, saved every scrap of gold dust, and endured 2 brutal winters for the simple dream of not being alone anymore. And now, this. He glanced back at Anya, her small frame swallowed by the fur clothing, her face a serene mask. She seemed completely at peace, which only deepened his frustration. What had she been told? What did she think this was? He pushed open the heavy wooden door of his cabin, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was a single room, cluttered with mining tools, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow cot. The air was stale and cold. He threw a few logs into the stove and struck a match, the tiny flame a welcome splash of warmth. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Anya stepped inside, her eyes taking in the space with a calm curiosity. She set down the small leather bag she carried and moved to the corner where she carefully began to fold and arrange the furs on her person. Her movements were purposeful and efficient, a stark contrast to his own clumsy, frustrated gestures. "You'll be sleeping on the floor," Henry said gruffly, pointing to a small, dusty corner. He immediately regretted the harshness of his tone. She didn't deserve his anger. Anya simply nodded, her expression unchanged. She spread a thick fur on the floor, creating a makeshift bed, and sat down. The silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. It was an impossible situation, and the weight of it felt like a physical burden on his shoulders. He busied himself with preparing a meal, boiling a pot of water, and tossing in some dried jerky and flour to make a thin, flavorless stew. He slammed a bowl of it down on the small table and pushed it toward her. She didn't move. "It's not poisoned, you know," he muttered. She looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her dark eyes, not fear, but a weary intelligence. She picked up the wooden spoon and ate slowly, her gaze fixed on the fire. The next few days were a blur of work and silence. Henry left the cabin early each morning to work his claim, his movements listless and uninspired. He'd come back in the evening, bone-tired and cold, to a cabin that was miraculously warm, a small fire already burning in the stove. The stew he'd left in a pot on the counter would be simmering on the hearth, and the place would be tidy, his tools neatly stacked. He never saw her do it. She was always there when he arrived, sitting quietly by her fur bed, mending a tear in her clothes or carving a small, intricate figure from a piece of wood. She was a ghost in his own home, a silent, helpful presence that he didn't know how to address. One evening, he came back to find the cabin filled with the rich, earthy smell of roasted meat. On the table was a small plate with a piece of smoked fish. His stew was still simmering, untouched. He looked at her and she gestured toward the plate. "From the creek," she said softly. "You should eat. It is good for the cold." Henry stared at the fish, his stomach rumbling. He hadn't had fresh food in weeks. He sat down and ate, the smoky, savory flavor a revelation. He looked up at her and saw a hint of a smile on her lips. That night, for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt a different kind of connection, a fragile, unspoken truce. She wasn't the woman he had asked for, but she was a survivor. She knew how to find food, how to make a shelter warm, how to exist in this brutal world. He realized that she wasn't a burden, she was a partner. A strange, silent and unexpected one, but a partner nonetheless. The resentment began to recede, replaced by a deep and humbling curiosity. Who was this girl? And why had she agreed to come to this desolate place? The unwritten rules of their coexistence began to soften. Henry started leaving a portion of his daily catch for Anya, and she, in turn, began to show him how to set snares for small game and identify edible berries in the tundra. Their communication was a sparse mix of gestures and broken English, but it was growing. He found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin, the faint wisp of smoke from the chimney, a beacon of warmth and companionship. One frigid afternoon, a terrible blizzard rolled in, trapping them inside the cabin for 3 days. The wind howled like a starving wolf, and the snow piled high against the door and windows. Henry tried to busy himself with mending his gear, but the close quarters and the relentless storm began to wear on him. He was sitting by the stove, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, when he saw her tracing patterns on the frosty window pane. She seemed lost in thought, her expression pensive. He took a deep breath and decided to break the silence. "Why did you come here, Anya?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Why did you agree to this?" She turned to him, her dark eyes steady. "My family. We are from a small village far north of here. My father, he needed medicine. A trader promised to bring it. He said if I went to live with a white man, the medicine would come. He told me the man was good, a prospector who was very rich." Henry felt a sharp pang of guilt. Silas. He had not only sold her into a life of servitude, but had likely lied to her family. "I have no medicine to give you," Henry said, his voice low. "I'm not a rich man." Anya simply nodded, her face devoid of disappointment. "I know. You're not a rich man in gold, but you are kind. You share what you have." Her words hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He had never considered himself a kind man. Life here had stripped him of everything but his stubborn will to survive. Yet, in her eyes, he was something more. "The trader, Silas," Henry explained, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. "He lied. He's a bad man." "I know. My people, we know to be careful with men like him." She looked at him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "But I had to try. For my father." The confession hung in the air, a bridge finally built between them. The ice between their two worlds began to crack, and something new, something real, began to emerge. Henry spent the next few hours telling her about his life, his journey from the east, the hopes that had brought him here, and the disappointments that had nearly broken him. Anya, in turn, told him about her village, the traditions of her people, the spirit of the land, and the stories they told around their fires. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened. They were no longer a lonely prospector and a lost girl, but Henry and Anya, two people trying to make a life in a world that was trying to tear them apart. Henry, with Anya's help, discovered a small, promising vein of gold in a nearby creek, not enough to make him rich, but enough to sustain them through the winter. And for the first time in years, the prospect of a new day didn't feel like a burden. As the snows began to melt in the early spring, Henry made a promise, not to himself, but to her. He would find a way to get her the medicine her father needed. He would use every ounce of the gold he had to make things right. He wasn't doing it for a debt, or because he felt he had to. He was doing it for her, for the person who had come into his life as a silent, unwanted stranger, and had somehow, in the deepest part of the desolate Alaskan wilderness, taught him what it truly meant to be human. They stood together on the porch of the cabin, watching the last of the snow melt away, the river beginning to churn and flow again. The sun was warmer. The air held the promise of new life. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. It was small, but it was warm. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, a quiet, knowing understanding passing between them. They were not from the same world, but they had built a bridge between them, a foundation stronger than any gold. They had found home not in a place, but in each other. If you've enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more amazing and immersive stories. Don't forget to like and comment on this video to support our work. Until next time.